Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the original style and tone while altering word order and phrasing. Mr. Doris, you are free. Oh, the river's wide, the road is long. Since the break of dawn, I've been walking here. My feet are heavy, but my heart stays strong. Hold on. Hold on to the glory. Hold on. Hold on to the story. Ooh. Of a love that always stays. Of a life that never fades. On March 18, 1942, a federal agent knocked on the door of an isolated farm in Baker County, Georgia. There, he found 23 black people who were unaware that slavery had ended 77 years earlier. Among them was an 84-year-old woman named May Louise, who still bore the scars of a whip on her back. Born free in 1858, 7 years before abolition, she had spent her entire life bound to land that offered freedom only in writing. Agent James Mollister, a war veteran with 12 years of service in the Department of Justice, had handled cases involving smuggling, murder, and Nazi conspiracies. But nothing could prepare him for what he discovered that March afternoon, as the sun burned the red dust of rural Route 47. That farm held a secret that contradicted everything America claimed to stand for. How was it possible, in the middle of World War II, while the nation fought tyranny overseas, that people were still living as property on American soil? The journey began 3 weeks earlier, when an anonymous letter arrived at the federal office in Atlanta. Just 6 lines, written in shaky handwriting on cheap paper. It stated that at the Turner Farm, 40 kilometers south of Albany, men and women labored without pay, slept in locked barracks, and were beaten if they tried to escape. The letter carried no return address, only a desperate plea ending with the words, "They don't know they're free." Mollister was 42 years old and familiar with the region. He had grown up in Virginia, the son of a Methodist pastor who preached equality but never challenged segregation. It had taken Mollister years himself to grasp the contradictions of the South, that blend of hospitality and cruelty, of Sunday hymns and midnight lynchings. But this was different. Slavery no longer existed. It couldn't exist. The 13th Amendment had guaranteed that since 1865. Still, Mollister had heard the stories. He knew that in remote corners of the Deep South, especially in rural areas, white men sometimes kept black laborers imprisoned through impossible debts, threats, and violence. They called it peonage, a system where a $10 debt could become a life sentence. Farmers provided food, shelter, and tools, but charged outrageous prices. A pound of flour that cost 15 cents in town sold for $2 on the farm. A pair of worn boots was worth a week's labor, and the workers never handled actual money. Only numbers in a ledger that always grew, never shrank. But to hold people who didn't even know about abolition, that seemed unthinkable, even for the South of 1942. Mollister spent 2 days investigating quietly. He spoke with the sheriff of Baker County, a heavy-set 50-year-old named Wade Perkins, who knew the Turner Farm and insisted everything there was legal. The blacks work of their own free will, the sheriff said, chewing tobacco and spitting onto the wooden floor of his office. He maintained it was a fair arrangement. The Turners were good people, attended Baptist church every Sunday, contributed to the community. But when Mollister mentioned the anonymous letter, he noticed a change in the sheriff's eyes. A flicker of concern, quick as lightning, before the mask of Southern hospitality slipped back into place. At a general store in Albany, Mollister spoke with local merchants. He learned the Turner Farm purchased large quantities of basic supplies, flour, beans, salted meat, lamp oil, amounts that suggested many people. Yet the farm never sold cotton or corn at local cooperatives. What did they produce? Where did the harvest go? An elderly black man who unloaded trucks approached Mollister when no one was watching. He whispered a single phrase before vanishing among the crates, "That place is hell on earth." On the morning of March 18th, Mollister left Albany at 6 a.m., driving his black Ford down a dirt road that cut through abandoned cotton fields and pine forests. He carried a camera, a reel-to-reel recorder, and his Colt 1911 pistol. He had no warrant, no official authorization. Technically, this was just a courtesy visit, a routine follow-up on a complaint. The Turner Farm lay at the end of a winding secondary road that snaked between low hills. It was vast, at least 1,000 acres of rolling land dotted with scattered buildings. The main house, a 2-story structure with peeling white columns and a broad porch, stood on a slight rise. Farther down, Mollister spotted long, dark wooden barracks, cultivated fields, and in the distance, smoke rising from a chimney. There was no gate, only an open entrance. Mollister drove slowly, observing everything. He saw no one in the fields, though it was nearly 8 o'clock in the morning, when farm work should have been well underway. The place was strangely silent, as if holding its breath. He parked before the main house and stepped out. The Georgia spring heat was already intense. He climbed the porch steps and knocked. Waited. Knocked again. The door opened to reveal a white man around 60, tall and thin, with gray hair swept back and cold blue eyes. He wore linen pants and a white shirt with suspenders. He did not smile. "Can I help you?" Mollister showed his identification. "James Mollister, Department of Justice. I need to speak with Mr. Harold Turner." The man studied the badge for a long moment. "I'm Harold Turner." "What is this about, Agent?" "We received an anonymous complaint regarding working conditions on your property. Standard procedure to investigate." Turner's expression didn't shift. "A complaint. I see. Come in, Agent Mollister. Let's speak civilly." Inside, the house was unexpectedly dark and dated. Heavy mahogany furniture, thick curtains, oil portraits of stern-faced men on the walls. The air smelled of mold and old tobacco. Turner led Mollister to a book-lined office. He sat behind a large desk and motioned to a chair. "So, someone has lied about my farm," Turner said, his voice calm yet edged with steel. "That doesn't surprise me. Some folks don't like to see a white man prospering through honest work. What exactly does this complaint allege?" Mollister kept his tone professional. "That you hold workers against their will. That they aren't paid, that they're prevented from leaving." Turner gave a short, dry laugh. "Absurd. I run this farm in accordance with the laws of Georgia and the United States. My workers have legal contracts. They receive lodging, food, and medical care. If they owe money, they work to pay it off. It's simple. I'd like to speak with some of these workers." Something shifted in the air. Turner leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "By what authority, Agent? Do you have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant to ask questions. You need a warrant for me to go beyond this house onto your private property, and I suggest you obtain one before I return." Turner stood. "Now, if you have nothing else legal to do here, I have work waiting." Mollister rose as well but didn't move toward the door. "Funny you should mention the law, Mr. Turner. Because peonage is a federal crime. Holding people in servitude through fabricated debts is involuntary slavery. There are men serving 10 years in federal prison for that." Turner's lips thinned. "Are you accusing me of something, Agent?" "I'm making observations. And I'll be back with a warrant." Mollister left, feeling Turner's gaze burning into his back. He didn't head straight to the car. Instead, he walked toward the barracks. If Turner tried to physically stop him, it would be an admission of guilt. The barracks sat about 200 meters from the main house along a dirt path. For long, low structures built from time-weathered boards beneath rusted zinc roofs. The windows were small and irregular, some covered with burlap sacks. Mollister approached the first barack and heard low voices inside. He knocked. The voices fell silent. He knocked again. "Department of Justice. I need to ask some questions." Absolute quiet. He waited, then slowly pushed the door open. It wasn't locked, but it groaned on rusty hinges. Inside was dark and hot as an oven. His eyes took a moment to adjust. When they did, Mollister had to steady himself. At least 15 people were crammed inside, men and women of various ages, all black, dressed in what looked like rags. Improvised bunks lined the walls. A bucket sat in a corner as a toilet. The smell was unbearable: sweat, urine, despair. They all stared at him with expressions he couldn't fully read. Not exactly fear. Something deeper: resignation, emptiness, as though they'd forgotten how to hope. "My name is James Mollister," he said softly. "I'm from the federal government. I came because we received a complaint about this farm. No one here is in trouble. I just need the truth. Do you work here by choice?" No one answered. They glanced at each other, then at the floor. Finally, an elderly woman, bent with age on a low bunk, spoke. Her voice was rough and used. "Sir, we don't know what you want us to say. The truth. That's all. Are you paid for your work?" More silence. Then a younger man, maybe 40, thin as a reed, shook his head slowly. "We work to pay what we owe the master." "How much do you owe?" The man opened his empty hands. "I don't know, sir. The master keeps the numbers." "How long have you been here?" "I was born here," the man said. "My mother, too. And her mother." A chill ran through Mollister despite the stifling heat. "When was the last time you left the farm?" Blank stares. No answer. The elderly woman coughed, a deep, wet sound. "We don't leave, sir. There's nowhere to go. The master says we owe too much. Says if we leave, the sheriffs will arrest us all for theft." "That's not true. You don't owe anything worth your freedom. Do you know slavery ended?" More quiet. Then the elderly woman said something that froze Mollister's blood. "It ended, sir." "When?" Mollister stared at them. "In 1865. 77 years ago." The expressions around him didn't turn to relief or surprise, but to confusion, as if he were speaking another language. "Sir," the elderly woman said slowly, "my grandfather told me Lincoln freed the slaves in the war. But old Master Turner, this one's father, he said it didn't apply here. Said Georgia didn't accept those laws from the North. Said we still belong to the land." Mollister could hardly believe it. "And you believe that?" The woman looked at him almost with pity. "Sir, we never left this place. How would we know what was true? The master has guns. He has overseers. And when someone tries to run," she didn't finish, but her eyes dropped to the floorboards. "What happens when someone tries to run?" No one answered. The silence felt heavy as lead. Outside, footsteps approached. The door swung open. Turner stood there, now flanked by two large, muscular white men, overseers. One held a shotgun. "Agent Mollister," Turner said, his voice still calm but clearly threatening. "You're trespassing on private property and disturbing my workers. I'll have to ask you to leave immediately." Mollister didn't move. "I'll need to speak with each of these people individually. And I'll need to see your payment records and contracts. Not without a warrant. Leave now, or I'll call Sheriff Perkins to escort you out." Mollister assessed the scene, alone on an isolated farm, facing 3 armed men. Without a warrant, his authority was limited. And these people, who barely understood their own rights, wouldn't testify against Turner while still under his control. He had to retreat. For now. "But I'll be back," Mollister said, looking straight at Turner. "With a federal warrant. And with marshals." Turner offered a cold, confident smile. "I'll be waiting, Agent. Always happy to cooperate with the law." Mollister walked past them into the sunlight. He returned to his car, feeling every eye on the farm watching him. He started the engine and drove slowly down the dusty road. Before leaving the property entirely, he paused and checked the rearview mirror. Turner stood on the porch, watching. And Mollister realized something chilling: the men didn't look worried. He looked confident. Back in Atlanta, Mollister worked feverishly. Within 24 hours, he secured a search warrant, citing suspicion of peonage and civil rights violations. He enlisted 4 deputy marshals and a medical examiner. He contacted a black lawyer from Atlanta who specialized in civil rights cases. Every detail was prepared with care. They returned to the Turner farm before dawn on March 21, hoping for the element of surprise. They instead found the place eerily deserted. The main house stood empty. The barracks were empty. No sign of Turner, his overseers, or the workers. They searched thoroughly. In Turner's office, they discovered account books showing impossible debts accrued by those who worked there. One man owed $12,000 for 30 years of lodging and supplies. A woman owed $8,000. Sums that could never be repaid through farm labor. In the basement of the main house, they found shackles fixed to the wall. Dark stains on the concrete floor that resembled blood. Behind the last barracks, they uncovered something worse. Dr. Morrison, the medical examiner, called Mollister over with a trembling voice. He stood near a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed, looser, darker than the surrounding soil. "You need to see this," Morrison said. They dug. 30 centimeters down, they found human bones. They kept digging. More bones. Eventually, they uncovered the remains of at least 5 individuals, all showing signs of violent trauma, fractured skulls, broken ribs. These were the people who had tried to escape. Mollister felt nausea rise. Here he stood, in 1942, on American soil, looking at a secret cemetery, evidence of systematic murder, of people kept in slavery 8 decades after abolition. Where did they go? One marshal asked. Turner and the others. Mollister didn't know. But he had a grim suspicion. Turner had been warned. He'd had time to vanish with those who could testify against him. And in the 1942 South, with its networks of corrupt sheriffs and sympathetic judges, a white man with money and connections could disappear easily. Over the next 3 days, as the FBI took over the case and news began leaking to northern papers, Mollister investigated tirelessly. He learned Harold Turner had family in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. That the farm had passed from father to son since 1840, with the Turners known locally for being harsh with black workers. But he couldn't locate Turner or the missing workers until March 28. An anonymous phone call came, an elderly woman's trembling voice. She gave only an address, an abandoned barn on Route 6, 15 kilometers north of the Turner farm. Then she hung up. Mollister and the marshals arrived in under 30 minutes. The barn was dilapidated, half the roof collapsed, walls rotting. It looked long abandoned. But behind it, partially hidden by old hay, sat a truck. They entered with weapons drawn. The interior was dark and cold. Pigeons scattered from the rafters. From behind old stable partitions came sounds, low moans, movement. There, they found the workers. 23 people, locked in an old grain storage without food or water since they'd been moved. Weak, desperate, terrified. Turner had hidden them, hoping the investigation would pass. But Turner himself was gone. He had fled, leaving them to die. Mollister arranged immediate medical transport. As paramedics from Albany tended to the workers, he spoke again with the elderly woman from the barracks. Her name was May Louise Williams. She was 84 years old, and she told her story in a voice that was frail but clear. She had been born in 1858 on a nearby farm, to free parents who worked as sharecroppers. At 7, her parents died of yellow fever. A white man named Ezekiel Turner, Harold's grandfather, took her in, promising to care for her. She never left. He told me I owed for food and shelter, May Louise said, her voice trembling but firm. Said when the debt was paid, I could go. But it never went down. Always grew. When I turned 14, they put me in the fields. Cotton, corn, whatever, sun up to sundown. If I didn't work fast enough, I got the whip. She paused, gaze distant. Never knew about abolition. Old Turner said it didn't apply to us. Said Georgia's government didn't accept it. Said if we ran, the sheriffs would kill us or jail us for life. We couldn't read. Didn't know anything about the world outside this farm. How would we know he was lying? Mollister recorded everything. Others shared similar stories, generations born and raised on the Turner farm, slavery passed down like a hereditary curse. Some bore whip marks. One woman showed fingers broken years before when she'd tried to escape. An old man had the letter T branded on his shoulder as a child. Why didn't you send that anonymous letter sooner? Mollister asked May Louise. Why wait so long? She looked at him with weary eyes. Because we believed the master. But 3 months back, one of the young ones, Thomas, ran off at night. Went to Albany. Came back 2 days later, beaten bad, brought by the sheriff. Before he died from the beatings, he told us what he saw in town. She paused, the memory heavy. Black people walking free. Working in stores. Getting paid money. He said slavery really had ended. That the master had lied to us our whole lives. Thomas died, she said quietly. Master Harold beat him to death. Put his body in those holes behind the barracks. Said that's what would happen to anyone else who tried to run or talk of freedom. But I'm old, Mr. Agent, she continued. Lived too long in this prison. Had nothing left to lose. Found paper and a pencil in the big house when nobody was looking. Wrote that letter, put it in an old envelope, gave it to a boy who delivers supplies sometimes. Paid him with the only money I ever saw, a 10-cent coin I once found in the mud. Asked him to mail it in Albany. Mollister looked at this woman who had lived 84 years, 77 of them in illegal bondage, and felt an anger burn like fire. Not just at Turner, but at the whole system that allowed this, corrupt sheriffs, neighbors who knew and did nothing, a society that decided some lives simply didn't matter. The case exploded nationally. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, Washington published the stories. Photos of the rescued workers shocked the country. The FBI widened its investigation and found the Turner farm was not alone. There were at least a dozen similar operations across the Deep South, hidden in remote places, maintaining slavery through ignorance, fear, and violence. Harold Turner was captured 6 weeks later trying to cross into Mexico. Tried in federal court in Atlanta, he was convicted of peonage, kidnapping, forced labor, and 5 counts of murder. He received 5 consecutive life sentences. He died in Leavenworth Prison in 1957, never showing remorse. Sheriff Wade Perkins was arrested as an accomplice. It emerged he'd received $50 a month from Turner to ignore the situation. He was sentenced to 20 years. The 23 rescued workers received medical care, legal aid, and reparations from the federal government. May Louise Williams lived until 1958, exactly 100 years old. She spent her last 16 years in true freedom, living in a small Albany house the government helped her buy. She gave dozens of interviews, testified before Congress, and became a symbol in the fight against racial injustice. But the case left haunting questions. How many other farms existed? How many people still lived in captivity, hidden where no one looked? Investigations continued for years, revealing complex networks of modern slavery that persisted not in spite of the law, but within its blind spots. Mollister kept working civil rights cases until retiring in 1963. He never forgot that March day in 1942, stepping into a suffocating barracks and finding people who didn't know they were free. It stayed with him all his life. Years later, in a documentary interview, he said, "We think of slavery as something from the distant past, something that ended with the Civil War. But the truth is darker. Slavery didn't end because we signed a constitutional amendment. It transformed. It hid. It found ways to survive where the law didn't reach. And in some places, it didn't even transform. It just continued, generation after generation, hidden behind locked gates and threats of violence." He paused, his aged eyes growing distant. "What haunts me isn't just the Turner's cruelty. It's how many people knew and did nothing. Neighbors who heard screams at night and closed their windows. Merchants who sold supplies to feed slaves and pretended not to know. Authorities who looked away because it was easier, or more profitable, or because they just didn't care. Evil needs wicked people to exist, but it needs indifferent people to thrive." The Turner farm was confiscated by the federal government and eventually subdivided. The main house was demolished in 1948. The barracks were burned. But the hidden cemetery was preserved. The 5 bodies found were identified through old farm records and survivor testimony. They were buried properly in an Albany cemetery, their headstones bearing the words, "Finally Free." In 1962, 20 years after the rescue, a memorial was placed at the site of the former Turner farm, a simple slab of black granite engraved with the names of the 23 survivors and the 5 murdered. The inscription reads, "Freedom on paper means nothing without the courage to make it real." May Louise Williams died peacefully in her sleep on January 23, 1958, surrounded by friends made in her years of freedom. Her funeral in Albany drew over 300 people, including James Mollister, who traveled from Virginia to be there. In her casket, she held a framed copy of the 13th Amendment. Her will contained a letter, read at the service. It said, "I lived 2 lives. In the first, I was property. In the second, I was a person. The first lasted longer, but the second was worth 100 years. If my story teaches one thing, let it be this: freedom is not given, not guaranteed by laws on paper. It must be defended every day, everywhere, by people who choose to see injustice and not look away. Because when we look away, we become accomplices. And the silence of good people is what allows evil to prosper. The Turner Farm case eventually spurred legal changes. Congress passed stricter laws against peonage and forced labor. The Justice Department created a dedicated civil rights division. Yet change came slowly, resisted at every turn by those who benefited from the status quo. Today, few know the story of the Turner Farm. It isn't in school textbooks. It isn't part of the American narrative of progress and justice. It's too uncomfortable, it challenges too deeply the notion that slavery ended neatly in 1865. But for those who do know, it stands as a stark reminder: injustice doesn't vanish just because we outlaw it. It adapts. It hides. It waits for our complacency. And as long as there are places the law doesn't reach, and people willing to exploit others, the fight for real freedom never ends. The Turner land lay empty for decades, bought and sold but never built upon. Some say it's cursed, that it still echoes with the suffering it witnessed. Construction crews in the 1980s reported strange feelings, troubling dreams, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Maybe that's superstition. Or maybe some places truly do hold memories of their horrors. What isn't superstition are the documents, the trial records, the interview transcripts, the photographs of survivors, faces marked by decades of forced labor, but eyes that were finally free. These records rest in the National Archives, open to anyone willing to look, to anyone with the courage to face the uncomfortable truth that America was still enslaving people while fighting fascism abroad. James Mollister kept a photo on his desk for the rest of his life. It showed May Louise Williams, taken weeks after the rescue. She stands outside the Albany Hospital in a simple, clean dress someone gave her, holding a Bible. She isn't smiling. Her face shows too much pain for easy smiles. But in her eyes is a light that wasn't there before, the light of someone who finally understood she was free. Mollister would look at that photo when cases seemed impossible, when the weight of injustice felt too heavy. It reminded him why the work mattered. Why he couldn't quit. Why every life saved, every injustice exposed, every small victory against a corrupt system was worth the fight. When Mollister died in 1974 at age 74, the photo sat on the table beside his bed. His son found it after the funeral and, reading the note on the back, understood this elderly woman represented everything his father believed in. He donated the image to the National Archives, where it remains today, a silent testament to a story America would rather forget. But stories like this shouldn't be forgotten. They should be told again and again, passed down not to foster anger or guilt, but to remind us to stay vigilant. To remember that freedom is fragile. That justice isn't automatic. That progress isn't inevitable. And that sometimes, in forgotten places, people still wait for someone who cares enough to look for them, to listen, and to finally tell them the truth they should have known from birth. You are free. You always were. And no one has the right to take that from you. The Turner Farm was just one. How many others existed? How many stories remain buried, literally and figuratively? These questions have no final answers. But the 1942 case proved something vital: the line between past and present is thinner than we admit. The ghosts of slavery weren't banished by a constitutional amendment. The work of building a truly free and just society continues, demanding courage, vigilance, and an absolute refusal to look away when we encounter evil. May Louise Williams lived 84 years, 77 in captivity, 16 in freedom. A terrible ratio, a brutal math that sums up decades of stolen life. But those final 16 years, she lived them fully. She learned to read. She voted. She traveled to Washington and saw the monuments of Lincoln and Jefferson, men who wrote of freedom while her country still denied it to her. She met grandchildren born free, who would never know the whip or the constant fear that defined her existence. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, in a comfortable bed in a home that was hers, surrounded by people who loved her, May Louise Williams died a free woman. Not as property, not as an entry in a ledger, but as a human being with a name, a history, and a dignity no one could ever take away. That, perhaps, is the true victory of this story. Not merely that injustice was exposed and punished, but that those 23 people spent their final years as they should have spent their entire lives. Free.